name is Dr. Jeffrey Bludinger. I'm the director of the Jewish Studies program at Cal State Long Beach. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Most of you have devices like this in your pocket or purse, so at least turn the ringer off. So if it does go off, you will be wondering, why do I hear that ringtone? And you don't, that's coming from you. So, you know, you might think your ringtone is cool, but Reunited by Peaches and Herb has been cool for 50 years, so 45. Okay, so briefly, I want to thank the members of the Jewish Studies Leadership Board, whose contributions make these talks possible. We are 100% community funded, 100%, so thank you so much. Two last things. First, come back in, well, not come back. In December 11th, I'm bringing via Zoom my annual December speaker, Dr. Rafe Sonnenschein, political scientist, political therapist. He's here to talk about the election that we just had 2 weeks ago and help you process it and he will analyze what happened and what to expect. I have no idea what he's going to say, but I will send out the Zoom link, but it will be a webinar format, so just log on. You can log on from home, and it'll all be, you know, that's how it'll be done. He doesn't want to drive from North Los Angeles down here. It's too far. So, of course, our speaker flew all the way in from St. Louis. So, go figure. Okay, with that, that's my segue to introduce our speaker tonight. Sorry, I meant to print out my introduction, and I forgot to in all the chaos today. Hey, come on in, have a seat. Here. Okay. So, Dr. Isaac Amon, right?
Amon,
sorry, is Director of Academic Research at the Jewish Heritage Alliance. Sorry, I should stand back here. A educational platform dedicated to promoting the legacy of Sfarad, or Iberian Jewry. He earned a JD and LLM in dispute resolution and a JSD, which is a PhD in law, from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. He was a legal fellow at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, a legislative director at the Missouri Department of Corrections, and an ISIS war crimes investigator. This summer, Dr. Amon was a scholar in residence at Oxford University through the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, the ISGAP. ISGAP. Okay, I get the emails. And a sought-after speaker global speaker on legal history, international criminal justice, and Jewish memory, including anti-Semitism, crypto-Judaism, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. He is the proud grandson of a 20th century Ashkenazi Sephardi of 20th century Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi immigrants to the United States, and he has a website. So if you'd like to find out more, I got the website for him. So at that, I will introduce. Here you go. And I will push the button.
I actually did. So,
yeah.
I think we should.
Maybe he has.
I probably should. But I think I should have it on my final slide again for anyone who's interested. You can see it at the end. So first, Jeff mentioned, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here in Long Beach. I should tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the last time I was in the Los Angeles area was 2001. My father, OBGYN and professor of medicine, had a conference. We came as kids, and we went to Universal Studios, and we caught a Lakers game in the playoffs. Saw Shaq and Kobe play. Those are my enduring memories of Los Angeles, the only time I've ever been here, apart from this. So it's good to be back and for this event, this opportunity. So Jewish Heritage Alliance, as Jeff mentioned, educational organization, nonprofit, dedicated to researching, preserving, promoting Sepharad legacy of the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. And we really aim to bring the story of Iberian Jews to life. We do this through educational exhibits, mobile exhibits or capsule exhibits, webinars, on-site lectures, and even tours to Spain and Portugal. And we're about 50 organizations around the world, universities, communities, synagogues, institutions, all dedicated to promoting this legacy to the world at large. And so with that, we can get started, but of course, it's important to mention, I think that the talk like this takes on added emphasis and onus because we have just marked the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks, the single deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. And of course, this has resulted in an accompanying surge of anti-Semitism around the world, from Australia to the United Kingdom, from South Africa to Turkey, from Latin America to these United States. The Jew hatred is on the rise. And according to the Anti-Defamation League, most recently, as you may have heard, more than 10,000 incidents of anti-Semitism have occurred in this country in 1 year since October 7th. And according to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, 3.5 million American Jews, 60% of the entire American Jewish community, have personally experienced anti-Semitism over this past year. So, in other words, thank you for coming out. Thank you for being here. The world's oldest and longest hatred, whose origins are documented in the Hebrew Bible, anti-Semitism is an eternal shadow seemingly accompanying Jews on our global journey, on our wanderings around the world. But most critically, amidst this hate, Jewish life has adapted and even thrived, displaying a remarkable resilience and an indomitable spirit throughout time and space. And so in today's presentation, focus briefly on the history of Iberian Jewry, because this is, of course, where the Rhodesli and really Selahattin Jews come from. We'll look at the case studies of Albania, Bulgaria, Salonika or Thessaloniki, and of course end with Rhodes. And this is not only a story of extermination and annihilation or of death, but of life and the vibrancy that was, and which we should remember. And as well the stories of those non-Jews who helped to save Jews, the righteous among the nations. And we'll end with, again, the legacy, what it means for us today. And so situating ourselves geographically as we begin the journey, this is, of course, a map of the Iberian Peninsula, of the biblical Sepharad. As you can see, the Iberian Peninsula is shaded in that green color. It's the westernmost appendage of Europe, and it's really the confluence of continents, cultures, and civilizations. It's bordered or bounded by the Atlantic Ocean to the west, the Mediterranean Sea to the east, separated from Morocco and Africa by the Straits of Gibraltar, and it's separated from France and the rest of Europe by the Pyrenees mountain range. And of course, the countries that comprise the Iberian Peninsula are Spain and the turquoise color, with its capital of Madrid, the vast majority of the peninsula, and Portugal, the smaller western neighbor, which directly lies on the Atlantic Ocean with its capital of Lisbon or Lisboa in the southwest, and the city of Porto in the northwest. Now, Jews may have arrived in Iberia as early as the time of King Solomon. Speculation, certainly not conclusively proven, but we do know with certainty that they were there by the first few centuries of the Common Era, during the time of the Roman Empire, when Spain and Portugal were provinces, known as Hispania or Lusitania. When the Roman Empire fell in the west in the late 5th century, right, the Germanic tribes, the so-called barbarian invasions occurred throughout the western part of the empire. The Visigoths, Western Goths, became masters of Iberia. Initially tolerant of Jews, they converted to Catholicism in the late 6th century and inaugurated a series of bitter anti-Jewish animosity. We don't have time to go into that today, but it was an extraordinary century or so of persecution and discrimination. The Muslims conquer Spain, right, in 711, and as a result of the Muslim conquest invasion, this, of course, has beneficial effects for Jews, ushering in what's often called the Golden Age of Sephardic Judaism, or Sepharad, really in the 200 years from the 10th to the 12th century. It's not to say there's no persecution, but it is certainly a remarkable time and place when Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all children of the biblical Abraham, of Avraham Avinu, are able to live with and work with one another in relative amity, certainly vis-a-vis Jews living elsewhere, or I guess in other parts of Christendom, I should say. And it's animated by that spirit of convivencia, again, of relative amity or harmony, again, to a degree really unprecedented in European history. And it brings to the fore a number of great scholars, foremost among them Maimonides, Rambam, whose works are studied to this day, and the late Maria Rosa Monacchio at Yale University, who's seen here, dubbed this time period centered around Cordoba, the hometown of Maimonides, as the ornament of the world. Christian and Muslim forces vied for supremacy of the Iberian Peninsula over the following centuries, and over time the situation for Jews deteriorated significantly. And in 1391, or 5151 on the Jewish calendar, a series of riots and massacres erupted throughout the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and it's estimated that somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 Jews were killed, comprising every stratum of society, and as you see in scores of towns and cities throughout Spain in just a matter of months. But most significantly, tens of thousands of Jews are not killed. They instead throng to the baptismal fonts, and they end up converting to Catholicism, of course under duress, in an effort to save their lives and those of their children, and they become conversos or new Christians. And this, of course, exacerbates the question as to what's their identity, and this changes the course of Spanish and really Sephardic history. And so as we enter the 1400s, Spanish Jewry is but a shell of its former self. It's been estimated that by 1415, 1/3 of Iberian Jews, really Spanish Jews, had been killed. 1/3 had been forcibly converted. Only 1/3 remained as openly professing Jews. By the mid-15th century, the so-called purity of blood laws, the racial purity statutes, the limpieza de sangre, as it's known in Spanish, targeting conversos on the sole basis of having Jewish ancestry, which is, we can't help but think it's an eerie foreshadowing of the Nuremberg racial laws and a pathological obsession with Jewish biological identity, something that's transmitted, something that baptism can never efface. And again, it affects conversos for the sole reason they have Jewish ancestors, no matter how many generations have been removed. And this culminates with the establishment of the Inquisition in Spain in 1478 by Pope Sixtus IV. And as you see, the Inquisition lasts officially until 1834, 3.5 centuries. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain appoint Tomás de Torquemada as the Grand Inquisitor. His name has become synonymous with religious intolerance and fanaticism. And during his 15-year reign, he died in 1498, hundreds of conversos were burnt alive at the stake for the crime of practicing Jewish rituals and traditions in secret, hence the crypto-Jews. Thousands more have their goods and properties confiscated. Well, Muslim forces surrender, the last bastion of Islamic soil, Granada, right, the Alhambra, the magnificent citadel and fortress at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in Granada, UNESCO World Heritage Site, well worth the visit if you get a chance to go there. And 2 months or so after the Catholics conquer Granada, they issue the Alhambra Decree, or expel all openly professing Jews from Spain, really Spanish dominions, forevermore. And on the left is a copy of the edict. It's signed by the king and the queen, some other officials, and it's embossed with the royal seal. How many Jews left is still a matter of great debate and not known with certainty. As you can see, the estimates range quite wildly, from hundreds of thousands to more revisionist estimates in our own time of maybe tens of thousands. But whatever number we take, the consensus is that only half chose to leave. The other half converted to Catholicism, again, under extraordinary duress in order to remain in their homeland. And the final deadline to leave was August 2nd of 1492, which corresponds to near Tisha B'Av 5252, that great day of lamentation on our calendar commemorating the tragedies in Jewish history. And this really tears asunder the unity of Sephardic Jews. Half or so leave the Iberian Peninsula entirely. They go to North Africa and the Dar al-Islam, right, the Islamic world. North Africa, well, the Italian Peninsula is, of course, an exception there, and really principally the Eastern Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire. And of course, this is when they start to arrive en masse in Salonika and Rhodes and other parts of the Levant. Others leave Spain, go into the neighboring kingdom of Portugal, right? Similar culture, climate, and language, and of course, it's on the same peninsula. While Sepharad, of course, is retained in memory, as it still is today in diasporic communities, this is certainly an abrupt cataclysm in Jewish history, and from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE until the Shoah, the Holocaust, which we'll look at tonight, it's the greatest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people. And the map really shows it all. As you can see, they traverse really a pan-Mediterranean diaspora. Again, North Africa, the Balkans, Greece, on and up into what becomes the former Yugoslavia, others to the Levant, to Syria, to Lebanon, to the land of Israel, again to Izmir or Istanbul, where my own ancestors went, and to Salonika. And for those who entered Portugal, how cruel fate was to them. They thought they arrived in a place of refuge, and only 4 years later, the Portuguese King Manuel I ordered them expelled or to convert to Catholicism. And when they chose to leave, 20,000 or so converged at the port of Lisbon. They were forcibly converted. There was no choice given to them, unlike Spain. And so tens of thousands of Jews instantly overnight became conversos or new Christians. Synagogues and schools were closed, religious objects, Torah scrolls were confiscated, Jewish cemeteries were uplifted. By the end of the 15th century, accordingly, we can say that Judaism in Spain and Portugal, in Sepharad, as a living, breathing faith was no more, publicly, communally. It no longer existed. And for this series of actions aimed at annihilating a Jewish presence, it has been called a religiocide, an annihilation of faith. They sought to, I should say, extirpate Judaism as living faith, not the Jewish people. And for the Portuguese New Christians, right, they, of course, have another diaspora. They go really to Northern and Western Europe. They go to Amsterdam and Hamburg, to Denmark, lead the readmission to England, and famously, they cross the Atlantic all throughout the Caribbean, Brazil, and the future United States, establishing the first synagogues all along the eastern seaboard, and these communities endure to this day. This is thus the situation the Inquisition had. As you can see, it was a global presence in every ocean on 5 continents. And this lasted again for 3.5 centuries. There were very few places around the world where people could worship freely as Jews. In this situation, this geographical and generational persecution was unprecedented. Again, look at the extraordinary scope in time and space of this persecuting institution. It was unprecedented until the Holocaust, which is defined as the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators from 1933 to 1945, the 12 years of the Third Reich or the Nazi regime. 6 million Jews were murdered, and no term, no word existed to describe, to adequately convey the magnitude of the destruction. And so Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer seen here, who lost 49 relatives in the Shoah, creates the term genocide to describe the annihilation of a people. By May 1945, when Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, turns out Jewish communities have been annihilated across Europe. 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, 2/3 of European Jewry, 1/3 of all Jews on the planet, and 1.5 million children alone. And this impacts not just Ashkenazi communities, but Sephardi and Mizrahi. As The Economist itself noted, though, it will forever be impossible to fathom the extent of the Holocaust. I thought this was particularly poignant and eye-opening. It says, of the 9.5 million Jews in Europe before the war, 6 million were murdered, so that's the 2/3 that were lost. But if you spent only 5 minutes reading about each of the victims, it would fill every waking hour for 90 years. And so, Jewish communities, again, devastated, decimated, annihilated across Europe. We'll really just focus, of course, on the Balkans and southeastern Europe. Remember, the Holocaust is not only a pan-European event, it extended across the Mediterranean into North Africa. And again, these great Sephardic communities, ancient, majestic, regal, they were virtually annihilated. But we'll start with stories of rescue. In Albania, the only majority Muslim country in all of Europe, it ended up with more Jews after the war than before. 1939, only about 200 Jews lived there. By 1945, the number had risen tenfold. It turned out that, of course, during the war, during Italian and Nazi occupation of Albania, Muslim and Christian families hid Jews. And this is credited to the concept of Besa, which some of you may be familiar with, which is translated as a type of code of honor, a trust, a keeping the promise. It's deeply entrenched in Albanian tribal society, and the idea is that we're all in this together, we're neighbors, we're friends. Jews had arrived in Albania, especially after 1492, after the expulsion, and so we're in this together to combat the vicissitudes of life. And in 2023, the Albanian Prime Minister announced plans to inaugurate a Besa museum in Tirana, the Albanian capital, to commemorate and preserve this story for posterity. And you can see renderings by the architectural firm on the left. And to this day, Yad Vashem has recognized 75 Albanians as righteous among the nations. In Bulgaria, also a fascinating story, a Jewish presence was attested as early as 2,000 years ago, during Roman times. But in much more modern times, in the Middle Ages, the Ottoman Empire conquered that country, or that land, in 1396. Ashkenazim arrived first in 1470, and Sephardim en masse after 1492. A very prominent Sephardic Jew who transited the country, lived there briefly, was Rabbi Yosef Karo, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, the last great code of Jewish law in the mid-16th century. So by World War II, by 1939, 50,000 Jews lived in the country, mostly the capital of Sofia. just under 1% of the total population. In 1940, Bulgaria, having joined the Axis powers allied with Nazi Germany, issued a wave of discriminatory legislation. They stripped Jews of citizenship, barred them from holding public office, and expelled them from key liberal professions. They also imposed a punitive wealth tax in an attempt to confiscate whatever Jewish property or wealth there was. And as part of the Axis powers, they worked with, as we'll see, they worked with Italy and Germany to carve up Greek territory to try to recreate a greater Bulgaria. And as part of this process of occupying Thrace and Eastern Macedonia, they deported about 11,000 non-Bulgarian Jews to the death camp at Treblinka, where they virtually all perished. But in Bulgaria proper, it's a different story. It's one mostly of salvation. And this is credited to really this man, Dimitar Peshev, who was the deputy speaker of the National Parliament, the former Minister of Justice, who's been accorded the title of Righteous Among the Nations, working with a whole host of civil society, of ordinary citizens, of a group of parliamentarians, and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. This on the top is the Archbishop or Metropolitan Stefan of Sofia, the highest ranking prelate. Alongside Kirill of Plovdiv, they threatened to excommunicate any Bulgarians who went along with the deportation of Jews into Nazi hands. All 50,000 Jews were never handed over to the Nazis. They were, in many cases, deported from the capital to the countryside and forced to engage in often very dire, harsh conditions, but they survived. They were never again handed over to the Nazis. And so virtually the entire pre-war Jewish population in Bulgaria proper survived. And just about 10 years ago, the Washington, D.C. City Council announced plans, and they did it because I've seen it myself. They renamed the street in front of the Bulgarian embassy in Washington, D.C. as Dimitar Peshev Plaza to remember this man and this story for future generations. Those were the stories of rescue, at least at the national level, by and large. There's also, of course, the story of Denmark. We don't have time to go into that. Now, of course, we look at the two case studies synonymous with the destruction of Sephardic Jews in the Holocaust, Salonika and then Rhodes. So Salonika, the city, was founded 2,500 years ago by King Cassander, the brother-in-law of the famed conqueror of classical antiquity, Alexander the Great, who's seen in this mosaic. A Jewish presence dates to at least the 1st century, so 2,000 years ago. In fact, the New Testament tells us that the Apostle Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, he preached the gospel in the main synagogue of Salonika on 3 consecutive Shabbats. And so while the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, Jews were living in Salonika. These, though, were mainly Romaniot Jews, the indigenous Jews to Greece, who spoke Judeo-Greek, Yevonic. Ashkenazim arrived first, again, like Bulgaria, fleeing persecution in the Holy Roman Empire, followed by the en masse arrival of Sephardim after 1492. And over time, of course, Salonika becomes known in Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, as the mother of Israel, the Madre de Israel, or the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Prosperous, vibrant, and flourishing community, one of the most extraordinary melting pots in all of Jewish history. Over 30 synagogues are there, each named for a place of origin, pretty much from the Iberian Peninsula. Testament to their origins, as you can see just from the examples, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and Gerush Sepharad, the exile from Spain. By the early 20th century, Sephardic Jews comprise half of the population of the city. Ladino is widely spoken as the lingua franca, right, is the main language of commerce in the city, and Jews comprised every stratum of society. Industrialists, pharmacists, boatmen, dock workers. Of course, the port closed on Shabbat because of how many Jews worked there. And in 1912, in the First Balkan War, right before World War I broke out, the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the city since 1430, lost it. Greek forces captured it. And contemporaneous reports from London and Paris tell us that when Greek forces entered the city, already in 1912, Sephardic Jews were attacked and robbed, their stores were pillaged, and their synagogues wrecked. In 1917, a massive inferno destroyed much of the city, rendered tens of thousands of people homeless. This included the Jewish community, which was greatly impacted. And it spurred Jewish immigration, but nonetheless, still by 1939, by the beginning of World War II, 50,000 Sephardic Jews still called the city home. In October 1940, Italy under Benito Mussolini, which of course had allied with Nazi Germany, invaded Greece. Jews joined the Greek army in droves. They made the ultimate sacrifice, including Colonel Mordechai Freitas, who is seen here, who was the first senior Greek officer killed in action, fighting the Axis powers. By April 1941, Italians and the Germans successfully conquered and occupied Greece, and they, as you see in the color-coded map, created occupation zones. And so the fate of Jews largely depended on whose jurisdiction they fell under. The red was direct Nazi control. That's where Salonika fell. The green is the Bulgarian occupation zone. It's from there where the 11,000 non-Bulgarian Jews were deported to Treblinka. And this brown or yellowish is Italian control. And as long as Mussolini was in power, until September of '43, the Jews there were not deported. According to Dr. Isaac Matarazzo, a prominent physician and eyewitness who lived through this very difficult time, the final solution, the euphemism to the Holocaust, for the Holocaust, of course, proceeded in 3 stages in Salonika. Part 1 was the period of partial tolerance. Part 2 was persecution. Part 3 was destruction. So we'll go by turns here. Period of partial toleration commenced the very day the Nazis entered the Jerusalem of the Balkans, April 9th, 1941. 2 days later, they closed the very last Ladino newspaper in the world, printed in Rashi script, and they immediately created anti-Semitic newspapers to pump out Nazi propaganda. They disbanded the communal council. Members were arrested. They barred Jews from entering cafes and pastry shops. Jews were compelled to hand in their radios, so to be denied access to, of course, outside information. And then they initiated Operation Rosenberg, which is that Nazi task force designed to confiscate Jewish cultural heritage, tens of thousands of priceless objects in Jewish communities across Europe, to be taken to a think tank, an institute in Frankfurt am Main for a future study of the extinct race. By the winter of 1941 to 42, an incredibly harsh winter, hundreds of Jews, they do succumb to hypothermia, starvation, and disease. But nonetheless, it appeared that most Jews still thought they could weather the Nazi occupation. They're quickly disabused of this notion when the period of persecution began. July 11th, 1942, known as Black Saturday. 9,000 men aged 18 to 45 were compelled to gather in the main square of the city, Liberty Square, or in Greek, Platia Therios. And as the photos show, they were forced to perform humiliating exercises and calisthenics under a broiling sun. They were not given water. If they fainted, they were beaten. And at the end of this, of course, they were also forced to register their names and addresses, identities. About 2,500 were conscripted into forced labor battalions and sent to work on mountains and roads across Greece. And the Nazis offered the Jewish community effectively a ransom to buy back these men. They had to pay an exorbitant amount, something like 2.5 billion drachmas, which undoubtedly was millions of dollars, especially for that time. And the Jewish communities of Salonika and Athens were able to raise most of the money, but to settle the remainder of the debt, to get the men and boys back, they handed over the 500-year-old Jewish cemetery, which was one of the largest, hundreds of thousands of graves spread across 80 football fields, and one of the oldest in the world. And as Dr. Matarazzo himself tells us, having tortured the living, the Germans then turned to the dead. And the cemetery was destroyed in December of 1942, but significantly, the municipality of Salonika itself played a very active role in this process. They long coveted the space. It lay at the center of their vision of a Greek Thessaloniki in which Jews did not play a role. And so they literally uprooted the graves, as had happened, unfortunately, earlier in Sephardic history, as we mentioned. And the graves are used to reconstruct churches, line streets, line latrines, and pave streets. And if you go to Salonika today, you can still see Jewish graves in the most bizarre of places, and this explains why. And as a final insult, the Aristotle University, the largest university in the Balkans, was built directly on top of the Jewish cemetery. And all of this was but a prelude to the final destruction, which occurred within a relatively short period of time, only 6 months. The entire community met their doom. February 8th, 1943, the Nuremberg laws were formally applied to the Jewish community for the first time. They were compelled to wear the yellow star, forbidden to use public transportation. Jewish businesses were labeled and closed and often given over to non-Jewish competitors, Aryanized. And for the first time in the entire history of the city, the Jews are corralled into ghettos. None had previously existed in the 2,500 years of the city. And at this point, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Dr. Tzvi Koretz, very controversial figure to this day. He encouraged the Jews not to rise up, not to try to escape, but to trust the Germans when they said they were merely being resettled in Krakow. And, of course, they trusted him. It's not clear, again, if he exactly knew or didn't know, but regardless, he does share much of the blame by many survivors and their families, even of those who perished. And this is in direct contrast to the chief rabbi of Athens, Elias Barzillai, who, when confronted with a similar demand, destroyed or burnt the communal membership rolls and urged all Jews to flee, himself fleeing into the mountains. And this saved over 2/3 of the Athens Jewish community. The final solution in Salonika began on March 15th, 1943. The first of 19 convoys or transports to the death camps commenced. So 2,800 Jewish men, women, and children packed into the cattle cars on that day, comparable number going every few days, so that by August of 1943, virtually the entire community had perished at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Yom Tov Yaakov was the president of B'nai B'rith, and he did not live through the war. He himself perished at Birkenau. But in a posthumously published memoir, he pushed back against anyone who said, why didn't we rise up? Why didn't we try to escape? Well, one, they trusted the chief rabbi. But second, as he put it, let no twisted minds come and tell me that it was already known the Germans intended to send all of us, right, every man, woman, and child, to the crematoria. Not even our great-grandfathers read such a thing in history. There was simply no precedent for these Jews to know what was coming. And in a sense of the heartbreak, the fear, just the uncertainty gripping the population, this is a letter written by Serena Saltiel in Salonika to her son Maurice, who was a student in Athens. It's dated March 21st, 1943, so just a few days after the convoy started, or deportations began. And she says, what else can I tell you besides the slow agony we're going through? 3 trains have already left filled with unimaginable suffering. This might be the last letter I write to you. I bless you. May the Lord keep you. And if the Lord grants me the joy of seeing you again one day, I wouldn't know how to bow down before him. I send you tender kisses. A physical reunion was not to be. Serena Saltiel perished at Auschwitz. And one of the most extraordinary moments in all of European history, really in the history of the Holocaust, Archbishop Damaskinos of Athens and all Greece, the highest ranking prelate in the Greek Orthodox Church, seen here, issued a public protest condemning the deportations. He actually got about 20 leading figures from the arts, law, science, and business worlds to co-sign the letter, again, condemning the deportations, reminding everyone the Jews had been in Greece since time immemorial, that no distinction existed between Jew and Greek, quite literally, as the Apostle Paul had put it, and that history would remember these actions very unfavorably. And he was summoned to appear before SS General Jürgen Stroop, who had just arrived from crushing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and he threatened Damaskinos to be executed if he continued to protest. Damaskinos was actually placed under house arrest, but nonetheless he declared that the Lord spoke to him and told him to bear the cross of saving as many Jewish lives as possible. And so he ordered all Greek Orthodox priests, convents, monasteries, to hide as many Jews as possible, to issue fake baptismal certificates, and he had the very strong cooperation of the police chief of Athens, Angelos Evert, who also issued fake ID papers. His forces often looked the other way. They refused to cooperate with the Nazis. And so these two men together, it's estimated, saved perhaps over 20,000 Jewish lives throughout Greece. And mention must also be made of Princess Alice of Greece, the paternal grandmother of King Charles, who was a member of the Greek royal family. And she herself hid a Jewish family, the Cohen family, in the royal palace in Athens for 2 years during the war. And all 3 of these individuals are righteous among the nations. And in fact, Princess Alice is buried on the Mount of Olives. Italian consuls general also played a role. Italy was the only consulate that remained open during the Nazi occupation because they were allies. And so these 2 men did what they could to at least bear witness. Guelfo Zamboni, with the big spectacles, and his successor, Giuseppe Castruccio, alongside a very small staff, issued provisional certificates of Italian citizenship or nationality to a few hundred Jews, and they were able to transport them from Salonika to Italian-held Athens before the deportations began, thus ultimately saving their lives. And in August of 1943, right after the deportations finished, and the community in Salonika was destroyed, Castruccio actually wrote a memo to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, quote, "The Jewish presence in Salonika, founded before the discovery of America, is no more. It was liquidated amid atrocities, horrors, and crimes such as I had never heard of in the history of all time and of all peoples." And indeed, by 1943, the final solution to the Jewish question was in full operation across Europe. As the map shows, quite literally, all train tracks led to occupied Poland, to the death camps, and particularly to Auschwitz. We have here Westerbork in the Netherlands, from where the Dutch Jews, including Anne Frank and her family, the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, the descendants of the conversos who had fled there seeking religious toleration in the 15 and 1600s, had arrived. We have Drancy, suburb of Paris. My grandfather's own uncle was deported from there to Auschwitz, where he perished. We have Rome, the oldest community in the diaspora. They were shipped to Auschwitz. And Salonika's here at the very bottom of the map. We can barely make it out. That's how far south it was. It took 5 to 7 days to make this journey across the Balkans in Poland, not to be resettled in Krakow, as Dr. Zvi Koretz told them, but of course to be sent to Auschwitz. And about a decade ago, when I was in law school, I had the opportunity to go and bear witness. And yet, stories of rescue still continued amidst these scenes of cruelty and death. On the island of Zakynthos, a small island, 275 Jews lived there. On September 9th, 1943, right after Mussolini fell from power, the Germans arrived on the island. They demanded a list of all the Jewish residents, and Mayor Lucas Kerrer and Archbishop Chrysostomos, taking inspiration from Archbishop Damaskinos and Police Chief Angelos Everett, told all the Jews to flee into the mountains, and they handed over a list containing only 2 names, their own. All Jews on the island were saved, and these 2 men were recognized as righteous among the nations in 1978. By 1944, well aware the Allies were rapidly advancing on both the eastern and western fronts, particularly after the D-Day landings in June, the Nazis accelerated the final solution to the Jewish question, sweeping into all these areas that Italy had previously occupied throughout the Ionian and Aegean seas. These housed the small, ancient, majestic Sephardic and Romani-Ote communities, again, that had been there for centuries, if not millennia. And the numbers tell the story. Corfu had 1,800 Jews, shipped to Auschwitz, only 200 returned. Liros had 1 Jew, Daniel Rachamim, who was sent to Auschwitz. He perished. The Nazis sent a ship for 1 Jew. Chios, Crete, Kos had 100 Jews, virtually all murdered. And of course, Rhodes, the 1,700 or so, and only 150 returned. This all occurred right after the Nazis deported the last great intact Ashkenazi community of Budapest, Hungary as well, to Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. Turning to Rhodes, Rhodes, or Rhodos, however we call it in various languages, the Jewish presence is attested since antiquity. It's mentioned in the book of the Maccabees for at least 2 millennia. In 1280, Sephardic Jews arrived, fleeing persecution at Aragon, but most arrived en masse, of course, after 1492. And then in succeeding decades and centuries, they were resettled from major Ottoman cities, including Salonika, Izmir, and Istanbul. So of course, Rhodes maintained very vibrant contacts with these Ottoman cities, at least on the mainland. In 1502, the Knights of St. John, a Christian religious order that controlled the island, actually attempted to forcibly convert the Jews, a la 1492 Spain, and the death of the Grand Master annulled the edict. And in 1522, joy and relief came when the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, again, who is seen here, conquered Rhodes, ushering in nearly 4 centuries of relative religious toleration. They constructed the magnificent synagogue, Kahal Shalom, in 1577, which is the oldest synagogue in Greece, the last one on the island, I believe, that gives prayer services, and it's the destination site for weddings and bar and bat mitzvahs. Now, blood libel did occur in Rhodes, and it's important to mention. The blood libel actually is first mentioned in Jewish history, and we know that it makes its first appearance as early as 2,000 years ago. In the 1st century, Appian of Alexandria, effectively an anti-Semite, though of course the word didn't exist, he alleged that Jews kidnapped a Gentile, fattened him up, and slaughtered him to be eaten in the Holy of Holies. And this is refuted by Josephus in his work. That's how we know of Appian, because his works are not extant. But the point is, this allegation, or something approximating a blood libel that Jews kidnap a Christian child, kill him, has been around for 2,000 years. The first recorded case in the Middle Ages was William of Norwich, 1144, in England. And there's about 150 cases throughout the Middle Ages, throughout Europe. In 1553, a blood libel actually occurred in Turkey, in the cities of Amasya and Tokat, near the Black Sea. And I'm very proud that my own ancestor, Moses Amon, who was physician, this is an engraving of him, who was a physician to Suleiman the Magnificent, intervened on behalf of his co-religionists and actually obtained a firman from Suleiman the Magnificent ordering all future allegations of blood libels to be immediately taken from local courts, local judges, and taken to the Sultan for review. And so this set a precedent for future cases of blood libels. In 1840, in Rhodes, the same year that a blood libel occurred in Damascus, on Purim evening, of course, the Jews are accused of kidnapping a Christian boy, killing him, using his blood. And Greek Orthodox clergy and even European consuls, if you read the reports, it seems they blame Jews for killing the Christian boy. They besieged the Jewish quarter. And 8 Jews were arrested, including the chief rabbi, Jacob Israel. And one of these men, Eliakim Stamboli, was tortured, subjected to the bastinado. He was lashed 500 times on the bare soles of his feet. Not surprisingly, he confessed to the crime. And at this point, the Rhodesli community appealed urgently for assistance to Constantinople or Istanbul. And at this point, they then appealed to Western European Jewish communities. And the 2 leading figures of Jews in Western Europe at this time were Sir Moses Montefiore in the middle, and Adolphe Crémieux, who was a very famous French politician, also one of the founders and a future president of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, founded in Paris in 1860, still exists today. And they personally journeyed all the way to the Ottoman Empire, to Constantinople, and met with the Ottoman Sultan Abdul-Majid I, who reaffirmed the 1553 firman from Suleiman the Magnificent, and on top of it said that no truth existed whatsoever as to the merits of the blood libel. Now, in 1912, Ottoman rule came to an end, and the Italo-Turkish War, sorry, just take some water here. Italy conquered Rhodes and the other Dodecanese islands, and Rhodes is really the only Jewish community in the Levantine or Judeo-Spanish world that did not become part of a successor state of the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century, or not directly. So it's interesting, it passed immediately from the Ottoman Empire to Italian control. But from 1922 to 1936, during the rule of Italian Governor Mario Lago, it was actually relatively benign. Jews were integrated into society. It was something of a melting pot for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It's even been called a golden age. This very brief 14-year period. The Juderia, the Jewish quarter, had 4,000 Jews and 5 synagogues on the island. And in fact, Lago encouraged the Jews to open a yeshiva, the Collegio Rabbinico, to increase Italian influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it attracted students from Izmir, Aleppo, Sarajevo, Cairo, and even Ethiopia. Things changed rather dramatically in 1936. Lago was dismissed, and the Italian governor Cesare Maria de Vecchi, a very well-known fascist, took hold, also anti-Semite, and he imposed restrictions. Jews were barred from traveling, Jewish children expelled from schools. They were no longer allowed to observe Saturday as Shabbat or the day of rest. And in 1938, Mussolini finally capitulated to Hitler's demand and imposed Italian racial laws, which effectively spelt the end of Jewish life on Rhodes in 1938. The Collegio Rabbinico, the yeshiva, was closed, so only 10-year existence. And Jewish graves were exhumed on the orders of de Vecchi and used to construct part of the governor's mansion on the island. At this point, about half the Rhodesli Jewish community left the island. By 1939, also a law was issued that if they didn't have Italian citizenship, they were forced to leave. So 2,000 left, going to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, to the Belgian Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Central Africa today, and of course, famously, to the United States, joining cities where they had come perhaps even earlier. We have Portland, Atlanta, Seattle, where I was privileged to speak earlier this year to the Rhodesli community too, Desra Becerrith, and of course, to the Los Angeles area. The 1,700 are Jews who remained, who thought they were safe. of course, were about to face the full fury of the Nazi Holocaust. In 1943, Selahattin Jewish community had been destroyed. No news of this reached the Rhodes community. They were cut off from contact. And for 1 year, the Nazis did nothing. They lulled Rhodes Jews into a false sense of safety. Till suddenly, on July 19, 1944, all men 16 and over were ordered to appear, ostensibly to renew work permits. Instead, they were herded into the basement of a building and held hostage, and women and children were compelled to join them. And on July 23, 1944, the entire community, virtually, aside from a few people who were too sick or ill to be forced on the boats, they gathered at the port. 3 boats took them from Rhodes, stopped at Kos, picked up the 100 Jews, and took them to the port of Piraeus on the Greek mainland, interned them in the notorious Haidari concentration camp. And they were all shipped to Auschwitz. The total journey for Rhodes Jews lasted 3 weeks. The longest journey any Jewish community in all of Europe had to take to their deaths. And again, of 1,700 or so, men, women, and children, 151 survived. And today, courtesy of Cynthia Flash Hempel in Seattle, of the Seattle Sephardic Network, there's only 5 known living survivors. Sammy Modiano, Italy, who's 94. Stella Levy in New York City, who's 101, are probably the 2 most famous survivors we still have today. And this is where the bright light, the heroic figure of Selahattin Ülkümen, who of course is mentioned in the title of the presentation, comes into the picture. He was only 30 years old, the Turkish consul general on the island. And of course, because of the long-standing contacts between the Rhodes Jews and Turkish Jews, they spoke Ladino, same families, different branches, a lot of them maintained Turkish citizenship. And so Selahattin Ülkümen was able to save 42 Jews of Turkish descent who held not only citizenship, but their spouses and relatives, anyone who had even a tangential connection to Turkey. And the surnames of those he saved, I'm no doubt are surely familiar to people here: Al-Hadef, Amato, Barrow, Calvo, Galimidi, Soriano, Torrica, and Turiel. And again, courtesy of Cynthia in Seattle, there are 7 known survivors today from Selahattin's list. We all know Oskar Schindler's famous list. It's time, I think, we know of Selahattin Ülkümen's list as well. In retaliation, the Nazis bombed the Turkish consulate, injuring his pregnant wife, Miranisa, who succumbed to her wounds, but she did give birth to a son. And Selahattin lived long enough, as you see, to about 90 years old. He lived long enough to see his son become chief of protocol at the United Nations. In 1989, Selahattin Ülkümen was awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, and remains the sole Turk to this day to have been given this designation. When Sephardic Jews arrived in Auschwitz, right, they didn't speak Yiddish, many didn't speak German, they spoke French, they spoke Ladino, of course. They were linguistically isolated, even from other Jews, and many of them could not understand even, of course, German orders. And so the Nazis impressed many of these Sephardic Jews into the dreaded Sonderkommando units, special units picked for youth and health to dispose of corpses from the gas chambers. And this is one of only 4 photos secretly taken by members of the Sonderkommando, of course at great risk to themselves, showing them burning the bodies under Nazi orders. This is the closest visual evidence we will ever come to seeing the final solution in operation. And this is taken probably by Alberto Herrera from Salonika. On October 7th, 1944, the Sonderkommando staged a revolt, an uprising in Auschwitz. They briefly managed to blow up one of the crematoria. They held off the SS for just a few minutes. We know dozens of Greek Jews participated in the uprising. It seems led by Greek officer Joseph Baruch, who's shown here. 251 Sonderkommandos were killed in this uprising, and after the Nazis ruthlessly put it down, 200 more were stripped naked and summarily executed on the spot. And at least 30 women who worked in a nearby factory who were able to smuggle explosives to the Sonderkommandos and participated in the attempted uprising. They were involved, including Greek Jews, Matilda Hagoel, Allegra Uziel, and Arlette Yeruziel. And 4 Polish Jewish women who provided the explosives were identified, tortured, and executed. These are their faces and their names. We should remember them. They were going from right to left in clockwise fashion: Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, Alla Gertner, and Regina Safferstein. They were all 30 years old and younger. And eyewitnesses tell us that they were executed, they were hanged just 3 weeks before the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, so coming up on the 80th anniversary in January. And according to eyewitnesses, they cried out, Hazak v'amatz, be strong and of courage. And they sang Hatikva, the future anthem of the Jewish state, still believing in a better future for the Jewish people. Marcel Najari, one of the few surviving Sonderkommandos, buried his notes in anticipation of the uprising in a thermos bottle. He died in 1971, and the notes were posthumously recovered in 1980, deciphered in 2017, and part of it reads, almost always when they kill, I ask myself if God exists. And nevertheless, I've always believed in him, and I still believe that God wants his will to be done. And then he proceeds to name countries all over Europe where Jews were sent to Auschwitz and murdered, and of course, including throughout Greece, all Thessaloniki, Athens, Arta, Corfu, Kos, Rhodes. Total of about 1.4 million Jews, which is strikingly close to the accepted consensus of 1.1 million. Dario Gabay, the last known living Sonderkommando, died in Los Angeles in 2020, aged 97. And this is him on the bottom. 20 years ago or so, Auschwitz finally installed a plaque in Ladino acknowledging the presence of Ladino-speaking Jews who had met their death there. I don't have to read the Ladino, but it says the same in every language, of course in English. Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity, where the Nazis murdered 1.5 million men, women, and children, mainly Jews from various countries of Europe. Again, after 1492, diasporic Sephardic communities continued to carry the memory, the flame of Sepharad with them. Likewise, after Thessaloniki and Rhodes destroyed, there are diasporic communities that attempt to carry this on. But undoubtedly, these cities today are cities of ghosts. They had lasted for 4.5 centuries from the expulsion in 1492, and they were destroyed in just 30 months or so. As Cecil Roth, the great Jewish historian, put it, that island of 15th century Sepharad in 20th century Greece, and we could also say Rhodes, is gone forever. It's not only a community that was annihilated or destroyed, but a way of life. And in Salonika, of the 50,000 Jews, less than 2,000 survived, a death rate of 96%. And two who did were Moise and Sarah Borla, the parents of Alpert, the current CEO of Pfizer. Man I had the honor to meet a few years ago. But really the glory that was Jewish Thessaloniki and Rhodes, the grandeur that was those places, lives on only in familial and collective memory. And in the end, people may ask, well, what about the Mizrahi communities? What about the Jews of North Africa, of the Maghreb? And that's really a different story. But I'll just mention that, of course, they were impacted by the Holocaust. Again, it was not only limited to Europe. It impacted the entire Mediterranean. They were expelled from schools. They were stripped of legal rights, required to wear ID. They were conscripted into labor battalions or into forced labor. In Libya, thousands were interned in the Giadu concentration camp, and over 500 died. A few even were taken to the concentration camps in Europe proper, which is a subject that has not received a full analysis that it deserves. And of course, the notorious Farhud in Baghdad occurred, comparable to Kristallnacht. But by and large, the communities themselves remained. They survived the war. And what spared them from the fate of the European co-religionists? It was timing and geography. The 700,000 Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in North Africa and the Levant were saved due to the Allied invasion of North Africa and southern Europe, Operation Torch in 1942. But in Europe itself, over 50% Sephardic Jews were annihilated. Thessaloniki, Rhodes, I didn't even mention Belgrade and Sarajevo, and other even smaller communities. And it's a double tragedy because, in a sense, they were direct descendants of people who had survived the forced conversions, the expulsions, the inquisitions, only to be annihilated centuries later. Ladino song Secretos expresses the magnitude of the calamity. I'd like to write my remembrances, but I would need a sea of ink and a sky for the paper. La mar quiero por tinta, el cielo quiero por papel. And at Nuremberg, the trials, have to mention, today, by the way, is the 79th anniversary of Justice Jackson beginning his opening statement at Nuremberg to try to hold the Nazis accountable for these war crimes and crimes against humanity. As he himself put it, the Nazi movement will be of evil memory in history because of its persecution of the Jews. the most far-flung and terrible racial persecution of all time. The terror of Torquemada pales before the Nazi Inquisition. And I myself in law school was privileged to have met Ben Ferenz, the last living Nuremberg prosecutor, who died last year at 103. At 27 years old, he prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen, those SS paramilitary death squads that murdered 2 million Jews in the fields of Eastern Europe, most infamously in Babi Yar, near Kiev in September of 1941. And at the conclusion of the tribunal, the verdict, it reads part, and I thought it's so powerful, and it could easily apply to the atrocities of October 7th. The tribunal said, quote, "This was a crime of such unprecedented brutality and inconceivable savagery that the mind rebels against its own thought image, and the imagination staggers in the contemplation of a human degradation beyond the power of language to adequately portray." And a legal precedent is set that a distinction exists legally and morally between intentionally massacring civilians and those who die as an inevitable consequence of war as collateral damage. This year, U.S. Congress finally passed a bill which will go to the President to award the Congressional Gold Medal to 60 diplomats who saved Jews throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. You may not be able to see it, but some of the names we mentioned: Guelfo Zamboni of Italy, right, in Salonika, who saved a few hundred Jews. Roa Wallenberg of Sweden, very famous, people know from Budapest. Selahattin Ülkümen of Turkey. And of course, Chione Sugihara in Lithuania. The list goes on. It will be given to the next of kin, collectively to the families, and it will be preserved in the U.S. Holocaust Museum to inspire future generations. And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, to bring it full circle, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existentialist philosopher, famously said in 1946, right after World War II, in the Holocaust, if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would have to invent him. Well, in a sense, right, the Jew in the anti-Semite's mind is mythical. It's truly not representative of real living Jews. But Sartre himself seems to have had a volte-face. He changed his mind completely because in his final book, Hope Now, 1980, he says, outside of anti-Semitism, there's a profound Jewish reality that we have to acknowledge. One has to think of Jewish history not only as the history of the dispersion of Jews, but more critically as the unity of the dispersed Jews. And these were my grandparents. They didn't live through the Holocaust, thankfully. But as Jeff mentioned, I was privileged, I grew up with them. This was my grandfather from St. Louis. He, born in St. Louis, grew up through the Great Depression, fought the fascists in World War II, enduring anti-Semitism from within his own unit, fought for civil rights, and remained a plumber into his 90s. My grandmother was born in Ukraine, survived a pogrom at the age of 3 in 1919 in the interwar years, and she and her family made it to Ellis Island in 1922, right before the doors closed. And of course, her family remained behind, murdered at the Peshora concentration camp in Transnistria by the Romanians. And these are my Sephardi grandparents, Dr. Renee Isaac Amon from Istanbul, direct descendant of the 1492 exiles from Granada, who met Ataturk as a young man, spoke 7 languages, of course Ladino, encouraged me to carry on these traditions and these stories. And my grandmother from Aleppo and Beirut, Denise Safra Nahmad. So herself, her family left Aleppo in 1939, moved to Beirut. My grandparents moved to Chicago in 1957 when my dad was a small boy, but her family that remained in Beirut were forced to leave in 1960 to Milan, Italy, where 2 of her sisters still live today. And so all of these stories collectively live on, I think, Jewish unity through diversity. And all my grandparents now belong to the ages, but I keep them very close to my heart. And so in conclusion, final takeaways, ladies and gentlemen. Righteous among the nations, truly drops of love in an ocean of poison, as Golda Meir called them. They came from every walk of life: Christians, Muslims, agnostics, illiterate and educated, public figures and peasants, city dwellers and rural farmers, diplomats, clergy, royalty, Archbishop Damaskinos, Metropolitan Stefan and Kirill, Selahattin Ülkümen, Albanian Muslims. All these stories should be remembered. Their names and legacies must be preserved for posterity. The Holocaust truly devastated the Sephardic world, especially Salonika and Rhodes. They were destroyed, and still in many places these communities are rarely mentioned in Holocaust museums, and that really needs to change, especially as we are nearing the threshold of a world with no living survivors, and especially amidst the rise of anti-Semitism. And we know in the aftermath of October 7th, and as we're all living through, anti-Semitism will continue to endure, unfortunately, but we can take pride in continued global Jewish resilience and unity. Our ancestors have been through much worse, and we too will persevere. As Yosef Haim Yerushalmi put it, the Torah commands us no less than 170 times to remember, to zachor, to bear witness. It's the most frequently cited command in the entire Bible. And so from an Inquisition to the Holocaust, from religio-side to genocide, from October 7th, 1944 to October 7th, 2023, into this very moment, the Jewish people still live on. Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you very much. And if anyone is interested to learn more, JewishHeritageAlliance.com, my personal website, IsaacAmon.com, if you want to know more about my family, some law review articles I've written, anything else. So, thank you.
So, any questions?
Was there any resistance in Turkey or Greece after the occupation? Those that were able to escape?
Occupation of...
When German forces came in and arrested those that they were identifying, were there any who in fact were able to escape and provide a source of resistance to the occupying force?
So that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Not that I know of. I mean, nothing I've seen, but I could try to look more into that. That actually is a really good question, but I don't know off the top of my head.
And second question, were any of the survivors called to testify at Nuremberg?
So that's also a great question. The Nuremberg, the major tribunal, relied largely on the documentary record because they didn't want, and I know Jeff can speak to this as well, they wanted largely to tell the story in the perpetrator's own words, so there would be no question that it was true. And so they didn't really call witnesses. One of the few, and again, I don't think they called any of the Sephardic Jews to Nuremberg, but they are mentioned actually in some of the, if you go through the documents, I mean, it's dozens of volumes, right? I mean, it's an extraordinary record. I don't think they called any of the Sephardic Jews, but there is, the Russians, the Soviets actually called the Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever. He actually testified he wanted to speak in Yiddish, the language of his people, and he was forced to actually speak in Russian at the trial. So I don't know of any Sephardic Jews themselves at the major Nuremberg trial. Of course, at Eichmann trial later on, they're called, and that's when the testimony, reaches the whole new generation, and they want to give the voice to the people who went through it. Yeah. I guess, well, you there, and then. Yeah.
Andorra is up there. Was there a Jewish population in Andorra, and were they also dealt with in the same manner?
Also a great question. I don't know if there were Jews in Andorra, at least openly professing Jews. I'd have to look more into that. Now, it's probable there were people who were of Jewish descent. We're talking the conversos, because there were so many, and over time, so many were forced to convert that by and large, it's like almost everyone, an extraordinary percentage of the population had Jewish ancestry. But I'd have to do a little more research in Andorra to find an exact answer to that.
Was Andorra, how much of Navarre was there any connection between Navarre and Andorra? Because I know the Jews were expelled from Navarre later.
Right.
But I don't remember how much, I don't know the history of Navarre.
Yeah, the microstate. I have to also look into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the Spanish government still to this day has a list of conversos and only allow them to marry conversos in today. They've kept a name of all the people that were conversos.
So one of the places where that happened, I don't know about a list, but at least it's widely known in society, is in the island of Majorca, the Balearic Islands. So there, they were much smaller, and there are about 15 families. This might be what you're, because I know this, I know someone who works in the story of crypto-Judaism in the Balearic Islands, in Majorca especially. 15 families, the Shuetas, they call them, which is also probably, it's I think it's a Catalan, it's also, I think it means swine or pig. It's a derogatory name, but they've kind of it's my understanding they've embraced it, kind of reclaimed it. There were 15 families, basically were clustered together and married each other repeatedly over the centuries. So everyone knew who they were. You still know them on the island today. I don't know if they were, again, if an actual list was kept, but I do know that well into the 20th century, they were still subject to societal, economic discrimination.
Yeah, not
I
only
mean,
being able to own certain things.
yeah, I mean, writ large. And yeah, and a similar story, by the way, unfolded in Portugal and the northern town of Belmonte or Belmont.
Oh, I've been there.
Okay, so same thing. Very, that's also an amazing story that they survived. But again, very small number, a few hundred people marrying each other constantly to try to keep, crypto-Judaism alive through the centuries. Yeah. Okay, or if you want to go first, and then here, go ahead, and then.
No.
Or,
Okay.
oh,
I did the Rhodes of conversos and Coptic Jews that were here about 12 years ago. And there was a gentleman who could trace, that spoke to us, that could trace his heritage back to 1350. And when he went to apply for citizenship, so he could get European citizenship, he had to contact some of his family that actually was in Spain, but still in Spain, and they told him, don't, because if he identified himself as being Jewish, then that would affect them even within the past 20 years, that they themselves had Jewish roots, and they wouldn't support him or help him at all. It was fascinating to, he had it all documented because they kept good records. Inquisition kept good records.
I mean, you have to admire the irony in that the Inquisition, the stated goal is to be able to identify people, is now used by people today to reclaim their Jewish roots because they kept such good records. I mean, there are the famous Converso story you may have heard of is Ginny Milgram. I don't know if you, she herself she was born in Havana, Cuba, to a Catholic family. She felt a draw to Judaism, and I think when she was an adult, something about her grandmother, her mother on the deathbed, left her some tantalizing clues, and she found out, of course, they were descended from Jews, but she ended up undergoing an Orthodox conversion, even in Jerusalem, only to find out afterwards she was already descended from Jews, and she was able to trace her line 22 generations back. The name of her book is My 22 Grandmothers, going all the way back to 13-something as well in Spain. So the conversion was not necessary. So that's kind of an irony too. Most normative Jews today, how many generations can we go back? We have the presumption, right? Was it the Chazakah? But the conversos can document it. Many generations back. Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear your point of view on today's anti-Semites on the left. On the right, they have no problem confessing that they're anti-Semites. They say Jews were not present. On the left, they talk in code. They say, we're not anti-Semites, we're anti-Zionists. Those Zionists are colonial occupiers. And one of them actually said, compared October 7th, 2023 to October 7th, 1944, saying, oh, Hamas was just revolting, just like the Jews revolted in the ghetto. So I'd like to hear how you respond to that disguise of anti-Semitism.
Well, I think it's fairly sickening to try to co-opt. It's very sickening, fairly sickening, or very sickening and repulsive. To try to co-opt the uprising of Jews who were, of course, fighting, knowing they were going to be killed and liquidated, but fighting also like the Warsaw Ghetto to choose the time and place, to show they wouldn't go out, like was it the phrase, the sheep to the slaughter. Certainly it's a problem on the left, and cloaked in this rhetoric today. That's probably one of the worst and most dangerous manifestation of contemporary anti-Semitism. And one thing that ISGAP, where I was at the summer, really pushes is, you can be a very liberal person, but it's this anti-Semitism that is emerging on the left that really sees at this time no distinction, that denies the right of self-determination of the Jewish people to their historic homeland. And what's even, I think more palpable is even at ostensibly anti-Zionist rallies, why are Jews attacked? It's always openly, identifiable Jews. This is the point. If they want to say we're not anti-Jewish, but they always end up, it seems, you can see it on TV or anywhere, they go after synagogues, openly identifiable Jews. That's what anti-Zionism does lead, at the very least.
Because what I see is
Yeah,
the
to
opposite.
anti-Semitism.
I see self-loathing Jews who ally with these anti-Semites, and they say, "Oh, we're anti-Zionist Jews." That's what I'm seeing. Like
Yeah,
all those JVP and If Not Now.
Yeah, so that's also part of it. I was referring to people who aren't even Jewish who are trying to make that distinction at the right.
So
But
that's
yes,
their defense. They're saying, "No, we're not anti-Semites. We got Jews on our side."
right.
Of course, they're self-loathing Jews, but
Well, that's always been the claim, I think, today, that people say, well, I can't be racist because I have, friends who are African American or Hispanic, and it's all the time. That doesn't excuse a person's behavior.
Weren't there in the 1930s? Weren't there Jews for Hitler who
Yes.
said that, oh yeah, let's intermarry, let's assimilate and renounce our Judaism? Weren't there Jews for Hitler? Just like there are Jews for Hamas today?
Yeah, well, I think maybe, maybe I'd have to do a little bit more research into if there were Jews for Hitler, but it's clear there were Jews who supported Mussolini in the beginning. There were Jewish members of the fascist party.
And I'll just say that there were Jews on the right in Nazi Germany who supported the authoritarian nationalist parties, not necessarily the Nazis, but there were Jews who, had Hitler not been anti-Semitic, they would have embraced.
Right, it
Yeah.
was all before Kristallnacht. There were no Jews for Hitler after Kristallnacht.
They
Before,
weren't really before either. That's all.
Right.
I thought there were.
No, they were on the right. They just were not.
Okay. Sorry.
Excuse me, can we go back to the topic on the relationship between the Greek people and the Jews? Because you mentioned that there were big persons of the Greek society who tried to save Jews, and the result is 90% of the Jewish community of Greece has been decimated, which is quite about the same number as Poland.
Right.
And in Poland, the anti-Semitism of Polish people was well known, but I never heard that the Greek were anti-Semitic. So could you tell us something? And back to his question, there was a big internal resistance in Greece, to my knowledge, which was mainly a communist resistance. Did they do anything to save Jews or not?
So it's limited, I think, to the areas around more Athens. Salonika is, the reason I think there was such a high death toll in Greece is because the very big majority was in Salonika, because Salonika had been so recently captured in 1912. Many of the Jews of Salonika didn't speak Greek, right? They were still speaking Ladino or maybe French because of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. So they weren't fully as integrated, as you could say, into that. Whereas the Jews who were in Athens, for example, spoke Greek, had been there for a long time, and also they were much smaller in number. I think it was also easier to hide. Salonika, they were just seen, I believe, more as outsiders. But in Athens, when the chief rabbi, Elias Barzillai, when he fled, the Archbishop Damaskinos offered to assist him, but also I think there were the partisans in the mountains who also offered aid and assistance to Jews who could make it there. It's just that Salonika was so far removed and under direct German control, there was really no opportunity. Yeah.
I wasn't aware of the Ladino language, so is it fair to say it sounds like it was sort of like Yiddish for the Ashkenazi Jews, and is that a fair comparison?
Yes.
And is that a good barometer? The fact that you mentioned there were some Jews in Greece speaking Ladino, and some were well acclimated or fully assimilated speaking Greek. What was the proportions in terms of the Jewish population in Greece that were fully assimilated versus recent arrivals speaking Ladino?
So it's actually that's a great question. So one, I think you can pretty much say that Ladino is the Sephardic counterpart to Yiddish, Judeo-German, Judeo-Spanish, right? So one, it's a way to think of that. These are my grandparents, right? One spoke Yiddish, one spoke Ladino. So I don't really speak either. Unfortunately, I didn't pick up my grandparents' languages. Some French, but they always wanted to speak to us in English. Now, regarding your question, yeah, so they spoke, Ladino is the language that they really took with them after 1492, and that kind of, the Castilian, right, the medieval Castilian that they took with them then eventually kind of merged or amalgamated with surrounding languages, so some French, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, and over time came to become this language. So I said, so the Sephardic Jews really, again, in the Eastern Mediterranean spoke Ladino as their main, again, as this main language. So when they got to Auschwitz, right, they didn't speak Yiddish. That was foreign. The reason that some were able to survive, and Stella Levy actually says this in her book, 100 Saturdays, that came out, a year or two ago. It's also a great read. That she was one of the Rhodes Jews who survived Auschwitz, 101 today. So in her book, 100 Saturdays, she was interviewed over a period of 6 years by Michael Frank. It's a very good read. And she says that she spoke French, and it's French that saved her life because when she was sent to Auschwitz, she was able to speak with French Jews who spoke Yiddish. So being in the women's barracks, they were able to translate the Yiddish for her. So if you didn't speak French, I mean, it was very, very difficult to understand. Eventually, over time, they said, you could pick up little snippets of German, and even that could mean the difference between life and death. But Sephardic Jews were at an really great or extraordinary disadvantage vis-a-vis Ashkenazi Jews. Just, again, because of that. Also, the climate they came from, right, the Mediterranean, dramatically different than Poland. Not used to these winters and to the snow and to, I mean, so they were completely disoriented and out of their element in almost every possible way. So I think it's actually extraordinary that as many survived as they did. Yeah.
You said in one of your slides that some of the Holocaust museums don't even have this story told at all. I know it's kind of easy to say like, oh, it's just a minority group of those killed during the Holocaust compared to those in Europe. But is there any other like reason in addition to that why this story isn't told?
So, I mean, it's a subject of debate. There are some people I've met who think although it's changing today, I think as more, say, Jewish families get kind of this intermarriage, if you will, intermixture like my own family. So everyone is probably a mixture. They have some Sephardic ancestors, some Ashkenazi. So it's not unique as it maybe was then. So some people think there was more of a concerted effort to try to marginalize these smaller narratives. I mean, we see that today just kind of writ large. I mean, whose stories are told, whose narratives are shared. There's a dominant one, there's kind of dissenting versions, or other ones that just don't receive attention that they should. I think probably it also has to do with the fact that it's just, again, if people don't know Sephardic Jews, people didn't really know they went through it, it's very difficult to tell that story. I mean, I myself went to one the last couple of years. I won't tell you which Holocaust museum, but they revamped it, and I went through it. There's not a single mention, even of Salonika, even in the timeline. They mention 1943, they mention the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they mention Treblinka, they mention Sobibor, and the entire community of Salonika was deported, 50,000 people. They don't even mention it, and I went over to one of the docents and I said, can you tell me about why Salonika is not there? And he looks at me and says, what's Salonika? And this guy's a docent at the museum. So I think this is a problem. Now, hopefully things are somewhat changing, like the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York finally included, they revamped their Exhibit 2. There are now some things they actually have of Sephardic Jews, and they actually have, very cool, I was also there a couple years ago, they actually have now a handwritten letter from King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, what to do with the disposition of Jewish assets after the expulsion. I mean, it's signed by his own handwriting. So they were so prominent to show me, look, we have something. It's this small little thing, but I guess it's a start. And I think there is increasing interest in it. I mean, it's not only, but that's the thing, now you know. So you can take this and you can tell people. It's not only Ashkenazi Jews who were impacted, right? I mean, it's the Jewish world at large. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, the most Jews per capita in terms of space were killed in Greece.
Right. So you said, and the gentleman said, right, so about 90% overall, and Salonika's death rate is 96%, which is even higher than Poland.
And I would just say that one factor also would be what happened, where do survivors go after the war? And the Sephardi and Mizrahi survivors mostly end up in Israel much more than, whereas most of them were more Ashkenazi. The survivors who come to the United States tend to be overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. So, for example, I happen to know someone whose family's from Libya, but most American Jews have no idea that there were concentration camps, like labor camps in Libya, that hundreds of Libyan Jews died under the Italian and German occupation, that there were slave labor camps in Tunis and Tunisia.
Right.
Most people don't know that because the survivors of Libya and Tunisia moved to Israel. So there's the American Jews don't have that kind of experience.
That could be, and maybe one other thing I'll just add is, you know, Holocaust museums usually want to be representative of the local survivors who came. So in St. Louis, for example, right where I live, they said maybe 700 survivors came, and we were down to like 2. Well, of course, there were no Sephardic Jews. So also St. Louis, I've given this talk a few times. There, of course, are a few Sephardic Jews coming out of the, you know, coming out too, who said, oh, my family was there. But by and large, like, no one even knew that. They never knew there were like Jews in Greece. They never knew the Holocaust impacted them. I mean, it's really astonishing in a way. But hopefully, again, there's now an interest. There's now more engagement, and this will change. As I said, especially as we near the threshold, no more survivors. It's important to share these stories. Well, if you just, we'll go him and then you again. Yeah.
For an academic question, in light of what's gone on in the last year, is there going to be a different look by Jewish people as to our own history, and also the word genocide, which is the big anti-Israeli, if not anti-Jewish word that comes up, but even the Pope recent days said, let's look into, is Israel committing genocide? So are we going to look at our own history a little differently, bring up some different stories, and are our own kind of terms like genocide going to be used by others to weaponize the Jewish people?
Well, I can even let Jeff answer the academic question. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, well, certainly we already see, but I'll just answer, say we do see genocide already, of course, being weaponized against the Jewish people. So it's also extremely repugnant and offensive. Again, the Polish Jewish lawyer Lemkin creates it. He was, you know, I think he was also an assistant to Justice Jackson at Nuremberg. And Ben Ferenz's trial, the Einsatzgruppen trial, is the very first time genocide's invoked in a legal context. And so, you know, Jews helped to try to build this world of legal accountability for these crimes, and now it's being turned against them. But as we know, I think as the late Rabbi Sachs, or Jonathan Sachs, whom I once had the honor to meet, he would say, right, in every age, I mean, we know that anti-Semitism metastasizes and, you know, to fit the prevailing ideology. And today, of course, what's the ideology is human rights that people are so much in vogue with. And so, right now, it's no longer Jews, but the Jewish state that's somehow uniquely guilty of human rights violations. Yeah.
Oh, I'm really reluctant as an historian
Okay.
to try to predict the future.
Yeah.
I'm more of an expert on the past. And what I will say this, the one thing that the study of the past has taught me is that straight line projections never happen in history. Everyone at every moment is always doing a prediction, straight line projection based on what's currently happening. And human beings are dynamic and things are constantly moving in different directions. So I'm really reluctant to make any prediction about the future. Let's make this the last question.
Okay.
Hanka, you're not
I've
Nicole.
read a few small articles because of saying that a lot of the people that, now that Christopher Columbus has supposedly been tapped as being Jewish, I just read the article, but they were talking about the DNA of his son. And,
Yes, it's all groundless.
it's all, okay, and dealing that they were using that because a lot of the Central Caribbean countries were still very angry at the way that they were treated by the Spaniards, Christopher Columbus and the ships that came over and the destruction, that they're now trying to transfer that dislike to Jews because Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, was proven to be Jewish. And I don't know if that was just a few rare articles or there's more talk along those lines, or it just was something thrown out now, part of
So,
I've been told.
yeah, I mean, the speculations existed for
For
as
years.
long as we've written books on this topic that he was Jewish. Even Simon Wiesenthal himself made that claim that Columbus, I think the book Sails of Hope, that Columbus was leading a mission of like crypto Jews, you know, to find a place of haven. Now, we know there were a few crypto Jews on board. This is true. Luisa Torres, the interpreter, most famously among them. It's not clear, it's probably groundless again that Columbus himself was Jewish. It's true he was, you know, conversos helped to finance the voyage. This is also, I think, true. But again, it is interesting though that they do come up with this news, you know, right before Columbus Day that suddenly the DNA from, you know, the bone fragment shows that he's, you know, Jewish, and now Jews are responsible for the colonization and the, you know, the destruction of the indigenous peoples. Again, it's been around for a long time. You know, I don't think he was, but you know, I think that speculation will always continue, you know, to be there.
So I'll just say this, just because I was
Yeah.
grumbling before. The person who published that story, it was not a scientific paper published in any
Right.
peer-reviewed journal. He did not present his evidence. He's not a respected scholar. He's a bit of a crackpot. And so, and I just keep pointing out to people, there is no gene for Jewishness.
Right.
You cannot take you cannot go, go from 23andMe and go to a rabbi and say, I have 85% Jewish DNA, I'm a Jew. You will not be accepted in any Jewish community based on a DNA profile. There is no gene for Jewishness.
Yeah.
Because people make money by selling papers.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
And I just would like to add too that again I know we're going through some tough times, but like I said, I think, you know, we have history to rely on as our guide. We know that our ancestors went through some pretty tough times, and we are still here. And if I could just conclude with just a brief poem, just a few verses. If you're familiar with Alfred Lord Tennyson, he has his poem Ulysses. The very end of that poem, I think, speaks that says, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So thank you all for being here.